Thank you so much for being on the programme.
Thanks for having me.
It feels like things are moving very, very quickly at the moment. What's your reflections on what we're seeing in the States, in Ukraine, in the globe?
So, I'm watching with a sense of despair and growing gloom because I sort of feel like the world order is changing in front of our very eyes. This afternoon, we've seen a vote in the United Nations where a motion that's supported by all of the European Union and the UK and Australia has been voted against by China, Russia, Iran, Belarus, Eritrea, and the United States of America. And that's something I just didn't think I would see. But amidst all of that, I mean, as a sort of commentator, freed of all the responsibilities of government, I can just wallow in misery. But for those who are still in government, what an incredibly challenging time to be navigating global affairs. And all politics aside, I think that Keir Starmer is on his way to one of the most consequential summits between a UK Prime Minister and a US President for generations. And I want him to be successful, really want him to be successful.
And how should he navigate it? Because you're right, it is an absolute tightrope to walk. There may not be a perfect solution here, to be honest, if we're really honest with ourselves. But how do you think he should navigate that meeting with Donald Trump?
I think both he and Macron have to go into their meetings with a very clear-eyed view of what the strategic objective is. Even if, amidst all of the noise that surrounds their meeting, there's a whole load of stuff that makes them really uncomfortable. The things that Trump's been saying, the things he stands for, the threats he's making to Europe and to Ukraine and whatever else. What they've got to go and do is almost ignore all of that and speak to Trump in first principles terms about the US's role in Europe, the fact that European security without that US backstop, that US guarantee, is significantly degraded, and that has a cost to the United States.
That's a problem, isn't it? Because if you take him at his word, he just doesn't believe that. He thinks that Europe's been freeloading off the US, and now's the time for them, or us, if you like, to, step up.
And in that respect, he's right. All the way through the first Trump presidency, he was saying that that Europeans are not spending enough on defence. For 2 years of his candidature, he's been clean on it. Oh, and by the way, Democrat and Republican presidents since the late 80s have been saying that, Europe is taking peace and security increasingly for granted. So there's no challenge there. He's right, and he will hold the mirror up to us in a way that is uncomfortable and should force us to react in terms of the way that we invest in our defence and security. But the other part of it is twofold. Firstly, Trump is a second-term president. He's not after re-election, he's after legacy. And does he really want the sort of defeat of the West, the defeat of Western values to be on his watch?
You think that's where we're at? You think that the defeat of the West and the defeat of Western values is the reality?
I think that there is a trajectory from this moment that could be exactly that. The triumph of authoritarianism, a return to national self-interest in global affairs rather than any sense of collectivism. So I'm not saying we're there yet, but I think that we could be at a moment of that gravity. So is that what he wants his legacy to be? But secondly, just reminding him of the United States geography. Yes, the US is a continent in its own right, thousands of miles from anywhere. But if Trump and those around him fear a confrontation with China, the idea that that happens exclusively in the Pacific and that there's no challenge to the US eastern seaboard from China itself or through Russia, who will increasingly become a client of China over the next decade or so, that doesn't stand scrutiny. So the US is always going to have an interest in Euro-Atlantic security, no matter how much it tries to focus on the Pacific. And I think that's a really important thing to remind Trump of in this week.
You started the interview talking about the big changes that we're seeing, the kind of huge undercurrents of things that have pinned our geopolitics for so long, starting to fray and fracture. Do you think some of those institutions are on their way out? I'm thinking about NATO, where Donald Trump has talked about, NATO not being backing peacekeeping troops in Ukraine, or the UN. You mentioned the vote today with the US siding with some very unnatural, unlikely allies there. Are these big institutions no more?
Well, I mean, I hope not, because I think they genuinely still have utility. And in many ways, the UN particularly has evolved, and not in a way that most Western politicians would like. You know, China is very influential across all the committees and groupings of the United Nations already. But the UN has continued to, hold its place in the world. And NATO, it definitely must endure, but not in such a way as just assumes that the US will contribute the lion's share. I think the Europeans have to view it as a transaction, that European investment in their own defence is rewarded by US continued involvement and commitment. But I think the stakes are high. There is that danger that an isolationist US, ever less bothered by global affairs and ever more focused on its own prosperity and its own internal politics, causes those sorts of institutions to weaken. And that bothers me enormously, because the last 120 years have really been defined by a rules-based international system of varying forms, League of Nations, followed by the United Nations, forged on the back of the horrors of the First and Second World War, and with a sort of liberal democratic free market ideology at its heart. And the idea that we're sort of reaching a point where those ideological, philosophical norms are seriously up for change is pretty sobering.
On NATO, you've said before that you think there should be a path for Ukraine to join NATO. Obviously, Donald Trump disagrees with you. I guess my question is, NATO is a nuclear alliance at its heart. Is it really sensible to have Ukraine and Russia both backed effectively by nuclear weapons? Is that not putting us closer to a nuclear war?
Well, maybe. I mean, first of all, I think NATO, first and foremost, is an alliance founded on collective defence, and the idea that greater security comes from pooling sovereignty and agreeing to fight for one another if one of you is attacked. Yes, there is a nuclear underpinning of that, but we should be clear on what the risks are of a peace in Ukraine, and it's a peace in inverted commas in Ukraine that doesn't have that sort of security guarantee, be that NATO membership or some other sort of EU or European security force with a US backstop. Putin may well come again. The war didn't start 3 years ago today. The war started in 2014 when Putin invaded Crimea and Donetsk. He then reheated the war 3 years ago today to take the rest of the Donbass, and if he had his way, pretty much all of Ukraine. The peace that may come, if not guaranteed in such a robust way, because the Minsk agreements did not succeed in deterring Putin from coming back from more, means that we just end up with more violence, more death, and that violence and death moving ever closer to the NATO border. So I think that guaranteeing Ukraine's peace in a far more robust way than we did in the second Minsk agreement is absolutely necessary.
Just finally, how much does the UK need to spend on defence, and how quickly?
At least 3% by the end of the decade. 2.5, 2.6 now, just to stand still. At least 3% by the end of the decade. And I think an actual, quite a neat way of calling Trump's bluff. And 0.1 sounds very little to you and I and to your viewers, but it's actually quite a lot of money. But actually a commitment to spend around what the US does, 3.2, 3.3%, would be a really good way of saying to the US public that actually the UK is leading in Europe. The UK, this is no betrayal of Brexit. The UK needs its relationship with France, Germany, the European Union and other European allies now more than it has done for 30 or 40 years. But it also must remain that bridge between Europe and the United States. And the way that we achieve a hearing in Washington is by being the first to meet Trump's expectations around what should be spent on defence and security.
OK, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.